Well, good evening, everyone. So nice to see you. Welcome to Stronger Together, our second session of Loving Your Spouse in a Chronic Illness. And tonight is going to be a very special night. We're going to be focusing on courage and hope in the shadow of Alzheimer's. And I have a very special guest with me tonight that I'll share with you in just a few moments. You'll see the comment section there, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, the chat areas invite you to just say hello there so that we know who's here and maybe just kind of give us a greeting. And so Judy, Lori, great to see you guys on here tonight. And we're just looking forward to others who will be joining with us. And there is a handout if you have had the chance to download it. The website where you can find it is there at the bottom of the screen. I'll leave that up for a little bit. No big deal if you don't have it. And before we get started here, don't worry about it. Don't leave and go get it. Stay with us. You'll be able to download it later, and we'll be pointing out some things as we go along. This, as I said, is our second session in a four-part series. We've last week was session 1, How to Thrive in a Chronic Illness Marriage. Tonight, we're doing Courage and Hope in the Shadow of Alzheimer's. And next week, session 3, Facing the Challenges of a Chronic Illness Marriage. And I'm very happy to have Mike and Donna Bassett, friends from North Carolina, who will be joining me, and we'll be talking about the challenges of a chronic illness marriage and how they are working through those. And then June 30th will be the final session, 3 things you must do, and I will be doing that session and focusing on really what I call a survival guide for a chronic illness marriage. When it boils right down to it, I think there are 3 things you must do if your marriage is going to thrive while you're dealing with a chronic illness marriage. So those are the schedules that we will be looking at the rest of the sessions. And I want to say just a little bit about Stronger Together for those of you who are new with us and are not aware of what Stronger Together is. It is a ministry initiative, marriage ministry initiative that my wife and I started about 11 years ago while we were in full-time marriage and marriage ministry. And it was developed to focus on helping couples who are dealing with a chronic illness or disability in their marriage. Cindy lived for 27 years with multiple sclerosis. It started off by giving her some issues with walking and then some of the numbness. But as it moved along in those 27 years, it progressed to the place where she was in a wheelchair. She was not able to walk. She was not able to transfer herself. I became her 24/7 caregiver. Again, for those of you who are not aware, you probably are hearing me talk about her in past tense. And that's because she passed away in February of 2018 with complications related to the progression of her MS. But the Stronger Together ministry of focusing on couples in chronic illness marriages was really her idea. It came from the Lord, but she was the one who kind of got me started and encouraged me to teach, and she was willing to share her life and what she was going through. So I miss her, but God gave us 45 and a half years together. Right to the day, really, that she passed away, 45 and a half years. But tonight, we're going to continue teaching, and I think it really is her legacy. So I appreciate you guys being here tonight. As I said, I have a special guest, and to help me go through this conversation about living in the shadow of Alzheimer's, Dr. Cynthia Fantasia. She's the author of the book. Whoops, I better show the cover. She's the author of the book, In the Lingering Light. I read it last fall, and it was, I think I read it in one sitting, and I just really devoured it. And I thought to myself, boy, I think Cynthia has something to share with those who are involved in a chronic illness marriage. And so when I was putting this particular series together, I reached out to Cynthia and asked her if she'd be willing to help me out. And she was very gracious and agreed to do that. So let me introduce her. She is backstage. I'll bring her out in just a moment. But for those of you who don't know her, Cynthia Fantasia served as pastor of service and women at Grace Chapel in Lexington, Massachusetts. And she speaks nationally and internationally. She's the author, as I said, of In the Lingering Light, Courage and Hope for the Alzheimer's Caregiver. She's a contributing author in a book entitled Mothers Have Angel Wings, and also another book, 30 Ways to Embrace Life. She was ordained to Christian ministry in 2007. She received her Doctor of Ministry degree from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. One of my alma mater as well, so I'm glad to share that with her. She and her late husband Bob have 3 adult children and 5 grandchildren. And at the end of tonight's session, I will be putting up her website so that you can visit her online. So let me. Okay, I got to get I got to get things moving here. Let me bring her in. There she is. Hello, Cynthia.
Hello, Willie. How are you?
I am doing well. It's good to see you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, let me. Yep. I'm not only hosting and interviewing, but I'm also handling all the technical stuff. And
I'm very happy as long as I don't have to do it.
Well, I don't multitask very well, so I might stop in the middle of a word to do some of these things. But it is great. And thank you again for being willing to do this. Cynthia and I have been talking over the last couple of weeks and just kind of going over what we wanted to do here tonight, what we wanted to share. And it's although I've known Cynthia or known of her for many years, it's really my first time getting to hear her story and talk to her a little bit. And so it's been an enjoyable experience getting to know you, Cynthia, a little better and to hear what God's been doing in your life. So why don't we get started? We'll dive right in. And it's good to see some folks looking at the comment section. Hopefully, there's someone there. Hi, sweet Cynthia, from Jean.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you see the comments?
I don't see any of the comments, no.
So
it might make me nervous.
They would make. All right, then I won't show them to you. But Jean Winterstrom?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we have Laura Whitehouse, who says, fabulous book. Maybe I could do this, you see?
I see that, yes.
Yeah, I can put that up and then, yeah. And we have some people from Virginia and Upper Michigan, so it's good. So why don't you start off by sharing with us a little bit of background about yourself and how your caregiver role developed with your husband, Bob?
Well, as you mentioned, I was on staff, pastoral staff at Grace Chapel. I had I don't call it a job. I never looked at it as a job. It was a ministry, an opportunity that I loved. Serving for about almost close to 25 years. And then around the end of 2012, I started to feel this restlessness in my heart. And I just came before the Lord and said, what is this all about? I don't understand why I'm feeling this restlessness. And it became clear that he was telling me that my time on staff was coming to an end. And I said, I don't think so. Can we talk about something else? Because I really love what I'm doing. But it became very, very clear. So I talked with my supervisor, and in January of 2013, I told him that I would be retiring in May of 2014. And that date is really important. So Bob and I were looking forward to this wonderful retirement, more time with our grandkids, more time to spend in our beloved Maine, and we just couldn't wait. And then he started to appear a little off. That's the only way I can describe it. Nothing we could really put our hands on, but So in January of 2014, 1 year after I told my supervisor I'd be retiring and we set the date, we went to the doctors. And at that point, Bob was diagnosed with moderate to severe Alzheimer's. He covered it really well
Hmm.
for about a year. He figured out, I think, how to cover this up. And the one thing I want to say about an Alzheimer diagnosis, when you hear that word, Alzheimer's, it's a shock, but it's not a surprise. You hear that, and then you think immediately of all you've been questioning and wondering about, as I was for the past, I would say, 7 or 8 months. And then you say, oh, now there's a name to it, even though
Mm.
your future is exploding right before your eyes.
Mm.
I sat there listening to the doctor. Bob was out in the waiting room with our 2 daughters, and he felt that his words and his voice seemed like they were down this deep, deep tunnel. And I guess he realized I was kind of out of it. And so he said, I heard him say clearly, Cynthia, how are you going to handle this? And I remember the words coming out of my mouth were, I'm just going to live on the other side of eternity. And that was the
Hmm.
only thing I could hold on to at that point,
Could
Willie.
I interrupt? What do you mean live on the other side of eternity?
Isn't that our goal in life? Our goal in life is to spend eternity with our Savior. I didn't realize that my loved one would be going there sooner than I had hoped.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
I think, when we stand before the pastor when on our wedding day, and that's the last thing you think of, is that at
Yes.
some point in your life, one of you will be separated by death.
Mm.
Say we make our vows until death do us part, but we don't really think about it. Um, so yeah, I said that was all I could hold on to. That was just the hope of eternity, knowing that I would see him again. I didn't know
Yeah.
how long he was going to be with me this side of eternity. I think the doctor thought I was a little weird, but that's okay. And we left. I wanted to know how long. He said, we don't know. I said, what should I expect? He said, we don't know. I remember a good friend saying to me, when you meet one Alzheimer patient, you've met one Alzheimer patient, because everyone is different. The trajectory of
Mm.
everyone is different. So we left the hospital, and Bob looked at me and he said, I told you I was fine. And he never acknowledged, through his whole 3 years of struggle, he never acknowledged that he was ill. So that was January of 2014, and I had until May of 2014 with my body in the office and my heart at home. And there
Okay.
were people who helped out until that day when I left, packed up all my stuff, and I walked out of one profession and into another one, and that is a full-time caregiver.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so Bob lived for about 3 years, and in October of 2016, he changed his address from Lexington to Heaven.
Yeah.
His path was rapid, sometimes, and for some people it's not. They can linger for decades, but 3 years, which I consider a severe mercy for both of us.
Yes. Sure. Sure. Well, in chapter 5 of your book, and it's interesting, the title for that chapter is Homesick. And I reread that book again a few days ago, or the chapter again. But you talk about the change that Bob's illness brought into your home, your marriage, and family. What were some of those changes, and how did you adjust to them? And we're especially, this particular series is focused on uh, husbands and wives. And by the way, how many years were you married?
48.
48 years. Wonderful.
Mhm.
Wonderful. So, what are some of the changes that, in terms of your marriage relationship, that you had to make adjustments, or you had to come to a place of acceptance, or maybe you even struggled with?
Mhm. Mhm. The word relationship in an Alzheimer's diagnosis begins to not exist. Bob became increasingly quiet. He was always, the life of the party and always had a quick answer and always very jovial and happy, but he became more and more withdrawn, not really interested in seeing a lot of people. He began to hide things. I became a really good detective. I found most of the things that he would hide. I would even go out some nights with a flashlight because I knew he would hide things on the side of the garage. The life, in a sense, that we had known was gone. We both grew up in Italian families, so loud and boisterous and jovial, and everything centered around food. And our life became very quiet. He couldn't deal with crowds. He couldn't deal with lots of people. So that was a hard thing. I missed our conversations.
Yeah.
We used to jokingly say we could solve the world's problems in one evening. We'd take long walks and talk about everything, and how I missed that. It was just an ache in my heart. The big thing too is I missed our shared history. I couldn't say to him, remember when one of our grandchildren would do this, or remember when we went on this vacation, because he would look at me totally empty, blank. So like you said, the relationship changes to the point that you have to make a decision. Am I going to just bag it, or am I going to make the best of this? And I think the best decision is to try and make the best of it. One day he started packing up. He worked at home. He had an office at home. And he started packing up everything in his office. And I kind of let that go for a while. And then everything was packed up in boxes and piled up. And I said, why is this all packed up? And he says, oh, I'm leaving. And I said, where are you going? And he said, well, I'm going to my house. And he mentioned the town where he grew up. And I said, you are? He says, yeah. I said, well, our grandkids are close by here. I don't think I want to move just yet. And he says, oh, you're not coming with me. He says, you can come back and come and visit me if you want. But he says, I'm ready to go. And those boxes stayed in his office like that for 2 years. He just lived in those long ago memories. His short-term memory was gone. So I guess the term that I've come to understand is ambiguous grief. And that is grieving the loss of someone who's still with you. And that is what an Alzheimer caregiver really has to deal with, is that ambiguous grief that you can't share with your loved one because you're grieving his or her loss, but they're still with you.
Yeah, I think I've heard it mentioned a number of times. Alzheimer's is the long goodbye.
And it's a series of small goodbyes every day, and something new to say goodbye to.
Yeah. So what sustained you? It was, you said 3 years that you were dealing with this, living with this, with Bob, with the Alzheimer's. What sustained you? What kept you sane?
Life became very simple. I think as a caregiver, you can either fight that and you can say, darn it, I just want my old life back. Or you can say, my life is over. This is my new life. For 45 years, Bob and I traveled as a team. And then at one point, when he became ill, we reached a fork in the road, and he went down one road and I stayed on the path that I thought we were always going to be on. So my goals in that season became twofold. First one was to preserve his dignity, and the second was to preserve my sanity. And so I did whatever I could to preserve my sanity. I'm a woman of faith. My faith held me together. it was hard. I chose never to ask God why. I would always ask him how.
Okay.
I was never one to get up at 4:30 in the morning to do my 2 hours of quiet time. Um, Bob would get up, no matter what time I got up, he was always up before I was. So, my feet would hit the floor and put the caregiver hat on, and I was on duty.
Yeah.
So we used to have, I figured out we would have a little quiet time together. I had a small devotional that just had a little prayer in it, and would sit down and have a cup of tea or coffee together in the morning. And I would read that with him, and then I would pray, and that was fine. And then it got to the point where he wouldn't even sit still for that. He would just get up. So I would quickly say to him, let's pray. And I would pray, God, give us a good day today. Help us to
Mm.
love one another and love you more. And that was it.
Yeah.
For myself, I would read Jesus Calling because it was fairly short, and I could just get a nugget of something to carry me through the day. But the Thessalonians verse where it says pray continually, that
Yeah.
took a whole new meaning,
Yeah.
because I would pray throughout the day.
Yeah.
Um, I would think of, things to ask God for, things that I was grateful for. I read an article once where it said, um, how do you pray? And my answer was, my prayer was always, help me, God, help me. And the author of this article challenged the reader and said, don't pray that way. How about praying, make this day count?
Mm.
So
Mm.
that revolutionized my prayer life. Um, when things went haywire, I would just say, Lord, make this count. Make this count for something. I think Gordon MacDonald said it in a similar fashion when he said, make today the best day. I knew on the Alzheimer journey that the next day was not going to be any better than this day. So make this the best day, and the next day would be the best day.
Mm. Mm.
I would hang on to a prayer that I would read all the time. I wouldn't memorize the prayer because I couldn't even think straight sometimes. But I think you're going to put that prayer up. That
Yeah.
someone is an Alzheimer caregiver or a caregiver in any chronic illness. I think this prayer would really be helpful. It's by Thomas Merton. Let me read it. My Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me, and I cannot know for certain where it will end. Boy, I really felt that. Nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. And this is the line that I clung to. But I believe that the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I'm doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I felt that a lot. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone.
Hmm.
And I clung to those words. I have no idea where I'm going because I felt so alone. We had a wonderful doctor who took great care of Bob and great care of me, but you don't know the road ahead, but God did. And so I would just cling to that one day at a time.
Yeah. I had not seen this prayer until you told me about it yesterday, and I just think it's so powerful for caregivers, so powerful even for a person who uh, has a chronic illness and is aware and is seeking the Lord. And I really like that last part. Therefore, will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you're ever with me. You will never leave me to face my perils alone. That was one of the things that for Cindy and me, that made a significant difference was our faith, and also just knowing that God was going to be with us, and he would, in fact, that's kind of been my life verse, that, the promise of God that he will never leave you, he will never forsake you. I found myself quoting that when I would visit people in the hospital, when they were in counseling, when people were in despair, just always coming back to, you may feel lost, and especially in a life or a season of life and marriage that's totally unfamiliar and just totally throws you for a loop. And you have to have some kind of foundation, that base that you come to. But it's that hope also, that hope that, at least in our faith, those of us who are people of faith, we know that God is not going to leave us. He's not going to forsake us.
Yeah.
He's going to help us get through this.
And you really feel that
Yeah.
going through the caregiver role
Yeah.
and the heartache of all of that. You really and truly feel God's presence.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the Jesus Calling book. I want to say that that was something that was very meaningful to Cindy. Our daughter gave it to her for her birthday and Mother's Day. Cindy's birthday is May 8th, and very often it would fall either on Mother's Day or very close to it. So Cindy was hospitalized one time, and in a very serious condition. Our younger daughter had come to visit and brought her the book, but Cindy was intubated, and because she was having breathing issues, so she wasn't really aware of the book until a couple of days later when she was conscious. And so we started reading it. I started reading it to her. And one of the things about that, you're supposed to read it in the morning. We tended to read it at night.
I still read it at night.
Yeah. And so I still remember times in the hospital as well as times here at home. We would read that devotional, and it would be exactly for that day. Cindy would just look at me and she would go, "Oh, I really needed to hear that." Or she would look at me and say, "You really needed to hear that today." Or we needed to be reminded of it. And it became something we did every night before going to bed and before praying, to read that. It became, God really spoke to us. And after she passed away, I had a hard time going back to that book. That's just my situation. But anyway, because of just the memories there. But it's a great book, I think, and an encourager to those who are going through chronic illness challenges.
I use it often as almost a journal, and I would write comments below the entry. And I've been reading it again this year, and I'm reading those comments that I wrote. And some of them there was so much pain and so much hurt and so much, Lord, I can't do this without you. Don't leave me. And there are times, Willie, that I will even say, and I believe it was God's grace that carried me through those really dark days. I'll say, wow, it was really bad. But going through it, yeah, it was really bad. But going through it, I felt buoyed up by the Lord and by friends who helped and family.
Were there days when you just felt like, I want to quit?
Oh, you want me to tell that story? I just told Willie this story just before we went on air. I have a dear, dear cousin who is a committed believer and a nurse. She specializes in Alzheimer's disease. And she came over one day to visit, brought lunch. We were sitting out on the deck. Bob was out with one of the Team Bob people. And she started asking me all these medical questions about Bob's condition and so forth. And then in the middle of the conversation, she looked at me with the beautiful, beautiful love in her eyes and piercing through to my soul. And she said, "And how are you doing?" And I looked at her and I said, "Pam, there are days that I feel like getting in the car and driving off a cliff." And she looked at me and I thought, oh, I'm going to get a sermon. And she said, don't do that. Airbags. And it just broke the ice. And we laughed. And she said, and remember that laughter is healing.
Mm.
And so that, yeah, and I think it's coming to grips with the reality of a horrible situation and being able to have someone help you to verbalize it.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
forever grateful to her for that.
Yeah. That's good.
I don't think I
Well,
would have ever done that, but
no, I'm sure there are these thoughts that pass through our minds that don't
yeah,
always get verbalized
yeah.
unless somebody asks and we feel safe enough with them to
Mhm,
say it.
mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know that you had some things that you really wanted to focus on, so I want to make sure we have time for that. Um, in chapter 11 of your book, it's called Reflections, and you have some reflections about your journey with Bob, and there were three of them that you wanted to focus on here tonight. So why don't you just jump right in there?
Okay, and remember these are reflections. These were written out, after Bob died, um, and I was reflecting on the journey that we took together. So the first one I think is very important, and it was shared with me by a dear friend who was going through this with her mother. And it's a simple phrase, it's the disease talking. There were many times during Bob's illness that he would say things that were hurtful, or he wouldn't say anything, and that was hurtful too. When he told me that I didn't have to move with him back to his home in his growing up town, which he didn't have a home there. But I kept saying that over and over to myself when those words would come out. And my husband was a very loving, contented, supportive man. Someone said to me, it would kill Bob if he knew
Mm,
how he was talking to you sometimes. So I would keep saying to myself, it's the disease talking. It's the disease talking. And in part, when you do that, you can embrace the disease. This is a very difficult disease. There's no cure, there is no real good treatment for it. Present time, there are about 6 million people with Alzheimer's in this country, and 16.5 million caregivers who
phew,
are basically loved ones. And you become a caregiver, you don't have any ramp up time. You become
mm,
a caregiver immediately.
mm.
Um, there's no guidebook, there's nothing to help you. You kind of make it up as you go along. So embrace the disease, but by embracing it and accepting it, you have to say it's the disease talking. This is not coming from someone whose heart is speaking. It's
So by having that, thinking that, having that idea, how did that help you process life with Bob?
mhm. um, in a way, I was able to be more objective.
Mm,
I could, well, the psychological term is intellectualize. I could kind of step back, and I could see that this man is not the man I married. That the book someone wrote titled "Still Alice," and I
right.
used to
Yeah.
say, it's not still Bob.
Mm,
This is not the man. He's not hidden somewhere deep inside. This is a new Bob, and I need to embrace who he is now. Understand some of the things that he says comes from the disease, and I will not let them enter my soul.
okay.
So,
So you were proactive intellectually, emotionally,
mhm.
proactive to maybe not go down some of the roads that your mind wanted to go.
Right, not climb
Yeah.
on the pity pot, and I know there were times that people would be over and he'd say something and they'd kind of raise their eyebrows, and I'd say, "It's the disease talking."
Mm,
And they'd look and I hope you remember that if you're ever faced with something like this, that it was the best advice I ever got.
mm, Mm. Good. Good.
So then the second one is keep short accounts. I know we're told to do that all through our married life. I used to
Yep.
joke with Bob when we'd have an argument. Remember, we're two sometimes hot-headed Italians. Um, so we'd have arguments, and he would say, "Well, we can't let the sun go down on our anger." And I'd say, "Well, the sun is shining somewhere in the world." But Alzheimer's disease robs a marriage of one of the partners. And
Mm.
so the other partner has to decide, how are we going to handle this? How am I going to handle this? Am I going to nurse my grudge? Am I going to nurse my hurts? Or am I going to do what scripture says, and that's to keep short accounts? There was one day that we had an argument early on in the disease, and he walked out of the room. I wasn't done with telling him how I felt, but he walked out of the room and he came back about 5 minutes later, and sweetest smile on his face. And he says, "Honey, you want to take a walk?" And I thought, okay, if he doesn't remember it, what good does it do me to remember it? So keep short accounts. I wish I had learned that early in our marriage before Alzheimer's entered. I really wish I learned that. I wish everybody would learn that.
Yeah, I do too.
And value the time, because our time is limited and we don't know how long we have.
Yeah.
And the third one, and I think this is the one that encompasses all of them, and that's intentionally pursue gratitude. Be grateful for what you have. Seek ways
Mm.
to be happy. Seek ways to be grateful. And if it's only to say to the Lord, I'm grateful today for your presence with me, that's good enough. That is good enough to carry you through. I honestly don't know how people handle this without the hope of eternity, without the hope
Mm.
of Jesus, without the strength that we derive from our faith. I don't know how they do it.
Yeah.
But to be grateful, and I think that's a head decision that we make.
Yeah. There was in my relationship with Cindy, the last I think it was probably with about 4 months before she passed away, and we didn't know. In fact, even the day that she passed away, she was in the hospital, but nobody, and she was very sick, but nobody told me, "Willie, you need to get your girls in here. You need to prepare." But I happened to just be with her when she took that last breath. It was just all of a sudden. Um,
And that
but
is a very holy moment.
it is a very holy. I've heard other people mention it, talk about it,
Mhm.
and yeah, very holy moment. And there was no one else in the room with us. It was just the two of us. Um, but a few months before that, we were having a conversation. Um, I went down a path, and now I've forgotten where I was going with that.
That's never happened to me.
Oh, never happened to, it's like that's what happens when it's late at night. Um, well, it's gone. So I'll have to come back to it. It'll probably hit me. It was a good comment.
I'm sure it was. They always are.
It was a good observation. So, oh yeah, the pursuing gratitude. If I would just look at my screen and see what that point was, we were talking about. She was talking about how things were really rough for her. The last 9 months of her life, she was not able to eat or drink anything by mouth by doctor's orders because the MS was affecting her swallowing muscles. And so she was not able to pass the swallow test. She would aspirate beverage or food into her lungs, and that would cause lung infections, pneumonia. And that was really what was, for the last 3 years of her life, recurring pneumonias. But as we were talking, she was kind of like, things are not going well. I can't eat. I can't enjoy food. I got to watch other people. I can't be around people. Things are really rough. She was just talking about the stuff. She had a trach in her throat because she wasn't able to, she was in a wheelchair and she just wasn't able to clear her lungs well. She had the feeding tube as well. And so we were talking, and then I said, well, yeah, things are pretty rough right now, but just let's think about the blessings that we have, and talked about our daughters and their husbands, our 6 grandchildren. And I don't remember everything else that I started bringing up. And then she started mentioning the blessings. And I will always remember, I hope that, where she said, I really do have good things. I have a reason to live. I have good things that are going on. So I think that intentionality to pursue gratitude is a very important one, whether it's, a caregiver for Alzheimer's or for any chronic illness, and even for someone with the chronic illness, to be able to be focusing on, can I find something for which I can be thankful? It really does a lot to your soul and to your spirit.
It just becomes as natural as breathing.
Yep.
When Bob went into a memory care facility, the first day he was there, I was told I shouldn't go for 5 or 6 days. So I said, I'm going to take a walk. And I was going to take the route that we usually took. That was really hard. I went to the end of our driveway and turned around and started back in the house, and then just said, I know I have to do this. And I said, I'll make it a gratitude walk. And honestly, I walked the route. It was 1 mile. And I was so caught up with thanking God for things that I walked right past our driveway. And had oh my gosh, I can't do this. I came back. But it becomes a habit, and we have so much to be grateful for. And I think the enemy would love to take our focus away from that.
Right. Yeah. Very often in marriage seminars and marriage counseling, I talk to couples about, what are you going to do to protect what's good about your marriage, about your relationship? And, it's that idea that Satan wants to rob you of what is good.
Yeah.
And even in a chronic illness marriage, even in these awful, challenging times, I think that pursuing gratitude is very important as a spiritual warfare technique.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a friend who does a lot of premarital counseling and marriage counseling, and one of the questions he asks is, what do you like about the person? And what do you dislike about the person? And then he says to the couple, he says, we usually like 80% of the other person, and we dislike 20%. And he says, and the part that you focus on is the part that will grow.
Yes,
exactly. And I think that is of utmost importance in a chronic illness marriage.
Yeah, definitely. Most definitely. Well, let's, I think those are great. And for those of you who would like to see the other things that are in that chapter, the other reflections, you certainly can purchase the book, and it's available on Amazon and, all the great book buying places. So I encourage people to get that and read it. Let's kind of begin wrapping things up here a little bit. Now, I guess the way I want to do this is to just talk about, what kind of advice or counsel would you give someone who and someone who is married to a person with Alzheimer's, but also to people who maybe have a close friend who is a caregiver, or a relative who's a caregiver of someone who has Alzheimer's? What are some things that you'd like to tell people?
Don't forget them. Don't forget them. Do whatever you can to make them feel that they are still a part of the routine of life. I had a friend, I still do, a friend who lived up the street from us. Her husband died 5 years earlier from Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
We pretty much raised our kids together, and she would just drop in whenever it was like she knew when I needed to see someone. Bob adored her. And she would just stay for a few minutes, and she would say to me, Bob looks great. You're looking great. You're doing a good job. Oh my gosh, that was oxygen to my soul.
Yeah.
Short visits. If you're going to the supermarket, call the person and say, hey, I'm going to the supermarket in an hour. I'll call you back in a half hour. If you need anything, I'll pick it up. Don't wait for the person to ask. It's very, very difficult for a caregiver to
Mm.
ask for help.
Yeah.
One of Bob's walkers, the first one actually, she came back with him one day and she said, I really think you need more help. She says, I'm happy to help once a week, but she says, you need more help. Why don't you call some people? And it must have been how I looked at her. And she said, do you want me to make some calls? And I thought, thank you, God, because I
Yeah.
was so vulnerable at that time. I don't think I could have handled someone saying no. I can't
Right.
do it. So she took care of that. She built a team that surrounded me and kept me going. I love the phrase, the power of presence. Just be there. If it's a 2-minute stop, someone used to stop by every other week or so, and she would just ring the doorbell and hand us 2 cups of coffee, give us a hug, and she'd say, I'm off, I got a meeting. And it was like, oh, she hasn't forgotten us. Or she was with her dog, and Bob loved the dog, and she would just sit for a few minutes. Don't call them. It's the worst thing in the world. Alzheimer's people kind of regress to toddler behavior. And every time I was on the phone for longer than 2 minutes, the dresser drawers would be emptied, or I'd have to call the plumber. Afterwards, I would call him up. Thankfully, he was a friend, and I'd say, it's Cynthia, and he'd say, I'm on my way. But you can't have long conversations.
Okay.
You can't have long visits, but you do need help. Become part of a team. Talk to someone who is helping the individual and say, how can I help? What can I do? So
Yeah, you've mentioned it a couple of times here tonight, and in the book you talk about Team Bob.
Mm.
So I'm assuming that those were the people that would kind of come around and help you, and even to help him, because you mentioned someone who would take him for a walk.
Several guys who would come and take him out to lunch, or one of them would come up with this great adventure that they would do, and they were very gracious and understanding the challenges as he got deeper and deeper into the disease. And there were times it came to the point that sometimes they would just sit in the backyard with him. But there were people who would walk with him.
Mm.
One time in particular, my son and I still laugh about this. One of his walkers was a lovely young woman, a blonde woman. She was just beautiful. And she would always walk with him to Dunkin' Donuts, and they would sit and have donuts and coffee outside. And one day, my son got a phone call from one of his friends and said, um, yeah, I don't know how to ask you this, but, like, is everything okay with your mom and dad? And my son said, sure, why? And he said, I just saw your dad up at Dunkin' Donuts was this gorgeous blonde woman. Oh, that's one of his walkers. Oh, we laugh, and
Oh,
but these people, when I wrote the book, I asked them all. I said, would you write just a couple of paragraphs or a paragraph about your experience with Bob? And every one of them thanked me for the opportunity they had to help and to be part of Team Bob. I
mm,
thought it was a burden. They thought it was a blessing.
yeah.
So,
Well,
and if
that's great.
you can't ask, get someone else to ask, but you can't do this journey alone.
Now, is this something that, let's say we have some people watching tonight or watching the recording, and they're leaders within a church or they're influencers in a church. How can a local congregation be
Yeah.
helpful?
Well, as I say in that last paragraph in the book, when I challenge the churches, I quote the former pastor of one of the bigger churches in Houston, and he says, when the people of God learn the facts, the people of God do the right thing. And I have always felt that the local church is the answer. The communities are doing great work with Alzheimer's support groups.
Hmm.
so forth. I would love to see churches do that. I would love to see churches pick up um, an opportunity for you. I didn't go to a support group because I couldn't afford to pay for a caregiver while I was in a support group. But wouldn't it be wonderful for a church to have a support group with a spiritual component, but then the Alzheimer loved one is off in another room in the church with some retired nurses or doctors
Mm,
who would love to give their time to provide a couple of hours reprieve.
yeah.
We talked on one other time, Willie, about the importance of knowing your legal needs, your financial needs, and
Yep.
understanding all of that. Wouldn't it be great for churches to offer that opportunity
Mm,
for volunteers, not to provide, really the legal work, but to give them information and say you need to see a lawyer, you need to get your will in order, you need to get your finances in order. You can't do that yourself.
yeah, that was, as you and I were talking earlier, I mentioned how Cindy and I sat down, and again, it happened about 4 to 5 months before she passed away. We had no indication that she would not live that any longer, but we needed to update our will. And one of the concerns I had, because I had become her 24/7, 365, 24/7 caregiver, there were personal care things that I did for her, and she was in the wheelchair, required transfer from the bed to the wheelchair to any other seating. And, so I was concerned that if something happened to me,
Mhm,
what she needed more than somebody just coming to sit with her. She needed a higher level of care. And so we sat with the attorney, and he said we were going to update the will, but he started out by saying, "Okay, Willie, what's your goal here?" And I said, if something happened to me, if I died before Cindy did, I want to make sure that she has the financial reserves to be taken care of, because as soon as I die, she will require 24/7 care immediately. And
mhm,
our daughters, might be able to do some of that for a little while, but they have families, children, and careers. And I so we set up a testamentary trust, which people can check on that. But basically, what it meant was that all of the assets would go into my estate, be protected from. You have to think about uh, Medicaid. I started to say Medicare, but you have to think about Medicaid protecting your assets and that sort of thing. So we set up a trust that upon my death, everything going. One of the things we did, Cindy was a little bit on. Now Cindy was able to, be a part of this with me, which might be different for
yeah,
somebody with Alzheimer's. But the attorney suggested that we remove her name from the deed of our house
mhm,
and just have it in my name, so that upon my death, it goes into the estate.
mhm,
And, it's not going to be an issue as far as Medicaid is concerned, all of that. So Cindy had a little bit of a hard time with that because she felt like she was giving up something, but we had to work through that. So it's a hard conversation,
mhm,
but I'm very big on encouraging people. In fact, I started talking to my children, and almost anybody who will listen to me, I'll go like, do you have a will? Do you
yeah,
have the
yeah,
durable power of attorney? Do you have the medical? Because when you're dealing with a chronic illness and your spouse is hospitalized, you have to make decisions if they're not able to. And it's important. I think in your book you talk about having the conversation.
conversation. I tell young couples to have the conversation. When Bob was in the hospital the last month of his life, and the doctor would ask me these really difficult questions, and I was able to answer them. And he said, "I've never dealt with a spouse who can answer the questions like you do." And I said, "These aren't my answers." I said, "Bob and I have talked about this over the years. Um, these are his wishes. These are his words." And so I encourage people before there's an illness to always have the conversation about end of life issues, about the legal stuff, the financial stuff.
Yep.
And I also encourage people, the caregiver needs to talk to the children because most often, if the caregiver dies before the Alzheimer loved one dies, the kids don't know the severity of the care or the disease.
Mm,
They don't know the heaviness of the care that's necessary.
yeah.
And so it's a horrible thing. They're grieving the loss of the caregiver, but they're also grieving, what do we do with mom or dad? So the conversation is important. And
Yeah.
you were talking about, doing the legal stuff. I remember when I did that, I dealt with a lot of guilt because I was talking about our assets, our home, and I was making those decisions. So
Mm,
it was something that Bob and I should have been doing.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so that was
But
hard.
you had to do that. And um, I really appreciate you sharing tonight. We're coming up to our
Yep.
time limit that
Um,
we said we were going to have, and I want to say to everybody who's watching, if you have a question, I'm not sure we're going to have time to deal with all of the questions, but you could put your question in the comment section. Those questions will stay there even after we end the broadcast, and if we're not able to answer your questions live here, we can, depending on who wants to, which of us is best suited to answer the question, we can do that offline or off air in the comment section.
or they could
So,
ask if they want to contact either of us through our website.
yeah, let me put that information up. Thank you for mentioning that. So there's my website, and then Cynthia's is there as well. And so whichever one of us you want to contact, you can do that. I'm going to come back in just a moment, Cynthia, and just say, is there one more thing? What's the last thing you want to say? But what I'd like to do is to just talk briefly, just remind people about next week. And so next week, we're at next Tuesday, 8 o'clock here on Facebook as well as YouTube. We're going to be in our third session of the Stronger Together, Loving Your Spouse in a Chronic Illness. And we're going to focus on there's probably about 7 or 8 challenges of a chronic illness marriage that I've identified. And I've invited Mike and Donna Bassett to be my guest and to talk about their challenges that they're navigating with Donna's cancer diagnosis. She was diagnosed 7 years ago, and they have been going through everything that someone goes through. 7 years, they're just really blessed. They're grateful that they've had these 7 years because it was stage 4 cancer. But I would invite you to tune in next week and also just share this. Those of you who are on Facebook, share it with your friends when you see the announcement, or you can go to my Facebook page and it will be there. But you can mark it on your calendar, and we'll be back. I'll be back next week with Mike and Donna. Let's see. So far, I don't see any questions, but people are making comments about, being thankful for what we've been talking about here. So, Cynthia, before we go, any last words?
I would say the important thing to remember is that you don't come out of an Alzheimer journey the same way you went in. It's important to allow God to do the refining work that needs to be done. Um, God is not there just for your spouse or your parent. He's there for you too. So allow him to comfort you, to refine you, to show you the way. He will. He'll do all that he
Mm,
promised.
mm. Good words. Good words. And I want to say to those of you who are caregivers, to be sure to go and download the handout. And what I'll do is I'll post that address. Let me just grab it here. In fact, I think it may already be. Yeah. Okay. So the handout is available on my website, williebatson.com. If you go to the homepage and you'll see the menu, it says online courses. Just kind of click on the down arrow and the Loving Your Spouse in a Chronic Illness will come up there. But on the handout, I wanted to mention that on the reverse side, page 2 has some ideas about, or some comments about caregiver stress, as well as some suggestions about how you can minimize that stress and really taking care of yourself. Sometimes I felt like if I wanted to go off and be by myself for a while, or I needed to do something for myself, that I felt like it might be selfish, but then I realized it's self-care. There are things that as a caregiver we need to do that where we take care of ourselves so we can be a better caregiver. And so, be aware of the caregiver stress aspect and be aware of what you can do to minimize that for yourself. So I think that covers everything that I wanted to mention as we finish up. And again, let me encourage you to purchase Cynthia's book, In the Lingering Light. You can find it on Amazon, or if you go to her website, she has a page where she has links to it from the various places where you can purchase it. If you know someone who is a caregiver of an Alzheimer's patient, Cynthia, would you encourage people to give that to the caregiver, to buy the book to give to the caregiver?
I highly encourage that. It was written, I wrote it in the fashion that so that someone could, like I found Jesus Calling, easy to read. The chapters are short. There's stories about other people going through this. My story is just my story. There were other traveling companions. There are prayers at the end of each chapter. It was meant to be an encouragement, meant to be a devotional. So yeah, I think it's a wonderful gift to give someone.
Good. Let's gift it. Well, why don't we close with prayer? And Cynthia, could I call on you to close us with prayer and pray for those who are watching as God would lead you, okay?
Thank you. Heavenly Father, you are a good and a gracious God, and you promise never to leave us or forsake us. Lord, I thank you that Willie and I have had an opportunity to share tonight about some of the real difficulties in a chronic illness marriage. Lord, I pray that the words that we spoke would be words of encouragement and words of hope to those who are in this situation. I pray that people were inspired to do something to help another caregiver. Father, there's so many of us out there, 16.5 million caregivers, and the numbers are growing. And so, Lord, I pray that we would become a force, a mighty force for good, a mighty force for you, that we would support and care and love one another and help one another through this valley and come out of it, because the light lingers for a while, but the light gets brighter and brighter. And so, Lord, I thank you. I thank you for the opportunity to share tonight, and I pray that it has touched the hearts and has grown the spirits of many. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Again, Cynthia, thank you so much for giving of your time and your experience, your life experience, and what God has taught you. And to everyone who's been watching, thank you so much for spending the time with us here tonight. And hopefully it has been helpful. Let us hear from you if there's anything we can do to encourage you. All right. So I'm going to say goodbye and end it.
Everyone.
Okay. Good night.